this extraordinary event. Steve, thank you for inviting me, and to everyone here today, I hope this will be an important day for you. Some of you are obviously very technically savvy, and that's wonderful. Some of you may not be. I'm going to sort of pitch it up and down so that we all feel that we gain something from today. I think what the musicians did was absolutely outstanding. If they're still in the room, guys, congratulations. It was heartfelt, it was soul, there was science there was love there was environment there was reality there. And thank you, Victor, for your presentation. And a lot of the things that you said, I'm going to elaborate on. I'm going to see this more from a medical point of view. I'm an integrative trained doctor. I've been in clinical practice for 38 years. I did my initial training in South Africa. I've done my nutritional and environmental training in Australia. I'm board certified in anti-aging medicine in America. I've done preventive medicine training for my Master of Science in Germany, and I keep studying and keep learning because this is life, and there's always more that we all need to learn and live as we travel through life. But all of this comes down to how I can care for my patients and for the people I love. Importantly, I have a lot of people who are sensitive to electromagnetic radiation. I have a large population of patients. I speak from my experience. These are people who are genuinely very unwell. I'm going to talk about them later in the presentation. The condition is called electromagnetic hypersensitivity. But the main reason I'm here is because I'm concerned about what's going on. I'd like to join the dots between the research and the boots on the ground stuff, people that actually walk in and sit with me and tell me their woes, and see if we can find a way through this for them. Just some housekeeping. Any bolding of the script is my bolding, especially when I've quoted the information, really just for emphasis. All photos are my own, or I've bought them, or I've referenced them. And so, as I understand, our phones are off already. Remember, you're not turning your phones off for me, but you're turning them off for you. Because if they're in your pocket, that could be a major problem. So let's get going. What do you reckon? Okay, so already we've heard about the Alpanza standard. This is an extraordinary document. Thank goodness it's a document that protects us from thermal effects of radiation. But as we've heard, possibly it doesn't protect us from the non-thermal effects in the 3 kilohertz to 300 gigahertz range. As you've heard, Alpanza is based on the ICNIRP, the ICNIRP Commission for the Protection of Non-Ionizing Radiation. This is a European-based company, and many bodies around the world use a similar ICNIRP classification for their standards. In the forward of the standard, in the document which I have with me, this is the Alpanza standard. Hold it closer to my mouth. Okay, there's currently a level of concern about radio frequency which is not fully alleviated by existing scientific data. It is true that the data regarding biological effects at levels below the limits specified in the standard are incomplete and inconsistent. So that is recognized by Alpanza, and they say that research is continuing in many countries. And that's great. But they also say in the standard that the standard discusses a public health precautionary approach to RF fields. Remember, RF is radio frequency. Radio frequency is 3 kilohertz to 300 gigahertz in the electromagnetic spectrum. And they say this is not a simple matter. There are costs involved adopting precautions, which is extraordinary, but true. They go on to say that there is, and that the science does not at all establish even indicative parameters on which a precautionary approach may be based. Or we can say, well, who's analyzing the science, as we heard from Victor today. And I'm going to talk with you a bit later about the enormous volume of science that is available. And I apologize to the trees for having to print this out, but I thought it's important to recognize that there are thousands upon thousands. In fact, there isn't an adjective big enough to describe how many studies are now showing the harmful effects of electromagnetic radiation. Okay. So are we really protected? Are we protected? So as I said, the standard is not designed to protect us in the non-ionizing radiation zone, and that the standard does not disclose 24-hour exposure levels. In fact, the standard is based on 6 minutes of exposure for less than 10 gigahertz, and only a few seconds or microseconds of exposure for above 10 gigahertz. So what about your baby sleeping in a room for 12 to 15 hours, being exposed to Wi-Fi, to radio frequency from towers? These are questions we need to ask. What about the heating effect that takes place? So the International Academy for the Research into Cancer, as we have heard back in 2011, classified EMF, radio frequency, as a group B possible carcinogen in the same category as lead and some other poisonous chemicals. However, all the way back in 2002, IARC classified extremely low magnetic fields. These are the magnetic fields coming out of transmission wires as also group B, being possibly carcinogenic. So let's look at some of the studies. Rather than doing what Victor did of taking a compilation of studies, I'm going to cherry pick. I'm going to take you into the world of some of these studies and look at individual studies just to get an idea, a flavor of what's going on. So these are leukemia childhood studies. Schultz, for example, in 2000 did a case-controlled study of 514 cases, 514 children with leukemia. And what was found was that the flux density, which is the measurement of the electromagnetic fields with regard to these power line cables, which is measured in micro-Tesla, and I'll go into this in a moment, anything over 0.2 to 0.4 micro-Tesla had a higher incidence. You'll keep seeing the word odds ratio, a higher odds ratio of there being a problem. And you can see in the 0 to 2 to 0.4 microtesla range, there was an increased risk of leukemia by, so the odds ratio is 1.2, that's a 20% increase. Greater than 4%, greater than 0.4 microtesla, the risk went up fivefold, so 5 times more. So about a 500% increased chance of leukemia. Another study on, again from the IARC monograph. If you look at the monograph at the bottom, volume 80, page 140, enormous number of documents that have been collected on childhood cancers. And this was 716 children, and again the distance from this 200 kilovolt power line substation was primarily responsible for the exposure to magnetic fields. Levels over greater than 0.3 microtesla increased the odds ratio by 2 times, a 2-fold increased risk. And similarly with this Danish study of children, similar odds ratios, again over 0.25, just for central nervous system tumors. There was no obvious risk, but malignant lymphomas went up to an odds ratio of 5, and the field strength over 0.4 microtesla for leukemia was 6, so 600% increased risk. There's been a wonderful paper by 3 very eminent professors, Professor Belpomme from France, Professor Hardell from Sweden, Professor Belyaev from Bratislava in the old Yugoslavia, which is now called Slovakia, I understand. Dr. Bergio and Dr. Carpenter, who's been one of the principal authors of this extraordinary document called the Bioinitiative report. And what they said was the scientific evidence for harm from EMF is increasingly strong. We do not advocate going back to the age where before electricity or wireless communication, but we deplore the present failure of the public health and international bodies to recognize the scientific data showing the adverse effects of EMF on human health. And these were the things that we heard earlier from Victor. Unfortunately, standards set by most national and international bodies are not protective on human health. This is of particular concern to our most vulnerable being our children. Given the rapid expansion and use of wireless technologies, and we know from our own kids, when we're busy, what do? We give them a phone to play their games. And how do they play their games? With their phone on their lap, very close to very vital organs, and we think nothing of it. And the problem is our babies, our children, they have a much greater susceptibility of developing disease because their organs are growing. The very cells, the very growth factors that grow their bodies are the very growth factors that cause cancer. This is called pleiotrophism, which means things that can do us good can do us harm at the same time. So we need to look after them as we do with absolute care. The greater protection of radio frequency radiation relative to head size and the potential of longer lifetime exposure. Great, thanks. Fantastic. You know, we use technology when it works for us, and we move beyond it when it doesn't. So I'll just have to keep this close to my mouth. Okay. So the same authors continued by saying, continually increasing exposure to EMF from all sources may contribute to rising brain cancer in children. After 2000 in Sweden, Hardell's work found this, as did a New English study by Phillips in England and Spanish studies. And there are other groups as well that have found this as well. This is becoming a groundswell, so much so that the French government have removed Wi-Fi from preschools and ordered Wi-Fi to be shut off in elementary schools when not in use. Isn't that amazing? And that is the start. In California, the use of mobile phones had special warnings and and advice is being offered on how to reduce exposure. So many of these steps are neither difficult nor expensive. It's actually common sense. It's about awareness. It's like knowing when we want to use technology, to use it safely, and then to turn it off and get rid of it when we're sleeping, for example. You know, we tell our children not to sleep with the phone under their pillow. You know that one? Not to have the phone next to them. To remove all electronics from nearby them, because there are magnetic waves coming, there are electric waves coming from the plugs. There's Wi-Fi in the house. If you have Wi-Fi in your house, things need to be turned off at night. We're not in use. So we need to protect our children. ICNURB's SAR is specific absorption ratios, or actually based on adult phantoms. What is specific absorption ratio is when you put a phone to your ear, children, the plume of the radio frequency goes much deeper into the brain than in an adult. And so the researchers, Belpoma and his colleagues, have said that the assumptions that it's safe to use mobile phones are invalid. One, because kids absorb radiation far more, but also because they're the non-thermal effects of radiation, not just the thermal effects. And as we've seen, the non-thermal effects are the very effects that can cause conditions like cancer. But we're also going to hear that non-thermal effects can affect the brain, the organization of the brain, an increased risk of autism, an increased risk of other neurodevelopmental effects, how children sleep, their cognition, their performance, their anxiety. All of this can get worse. And so, as I've described here, we can see the plume moving through the head from contact. This is an extraordinary document by Dr. Martha Herbert, a pediatric neurologist. She's a neuroscientist. She's on Harvard Medical School's faculty. She's at the Massachusetts General Hospital on the faculty there as well. And she's a co-author for this extraordinary document, the Bioinitiative report. And unless I've misread, the update, the Alpanza update, does not even make a one-word reference to the Bioinitiative report. She did a 60-page document with 550 citations on the relationship between autism and electromagnetic radio frequency. And without a doubt, she feels that there's a contribution between the exposure of people to all these wonderful toys and devices we have and the change of their behavior. She notes that there are thousands of papers documenting the adverse effects and neurological impacts. And we need to protect these very vulnerable little beings. There are studies talking about intracranial tumors, salivary gland tumors. This is a meta-analysis of 26,000 cases. And they found that, as we heard from Victor, the short-term use of mobile phones, there doesn't appear to be any obvious problem. But then it all depends on how the methodology of the study was set up. But more than 10 years is a problem, and how long we use the phone for. And as I heard, even though I was back there just relaxing before my big moment, how close the phone was never designed to be touching the ear. The product information always says, as I heard you mention, to be away from the ear. So when we're in a busy area where you can't put your phone on speaker and you put it to your ear, you are actually endangering yourself. Wherever possible, have it at the furthest distance away from your lovely little devices, EMF measuring devices, which can actually tell you, sort of boots on the ground stuff, what readings you're getting as far as power density. Okay, and this is another meta-analysis for glioma risk, and very similar risks over 10 years of use, or 1,640 hours, I think is the number, or very similar to that, where the risk increases. Okay. So this is fascinating. This was a meta-analysis which was done on the risk of brain tumors, or a systematic review of meta-analyses between the study quality, the source of funding, and the research outcomes. Doesn't that sound interesting? Because what we're hearing is when industry, thank you, stick your hand up if I get slack. When industry funds a study, what sort of result do you think we get?
No effect.
No effect. And isn't that unfortunate? What they found in this study was that studies with a higher quality showed a trend towards a higher risk of brain tumors, and studies with a lower quality showed a trend towards a lower risk. And what was Opanza's comment on it? Well, there's the reference. This is in the new Opanza update, that they recognized that over 10 years there's an increased risk of brain tumors, that the risk being 1.33 or 33% increased. And yet extraordinarily, in their 2017 research update, they still deem that there's no causality between mobile phones and radio frequency. And here they concluded that, the report concluded that the science behind the Opanza RF standard in their update remains sound, and that the exposure limits of the standard continue to provide a high degree of protection against known health effects of REEME, electromagnetic energy, they use that word. But professionally, I do not consider risk of brain cancer after 10 years mobile phone use a high degree of protection. And most of us have used mobile phones a lot more than 10 years, and possibly more than 1,640 hours. And that puts all of us at risk. So let's look at these numbers. I've been given access to the telco company's information document on the Wilson Creek tower, and you can see these strange, VPM, we're going to talk about that, volts per meter, which is the field strength, and you'll see all these UW per M2, so that's microwatts per meter squared, or microwatts per centimeter squared. Let's see if this, microwatts per centimeter squared, okay. Watts per kilogram is the SAR, the specific absorption into the brain. So we're going to look at these units, because when you understand your units, then it empowers you to understand, especially if you've got a little measuring device, what you're actually being exposed to. It becomes something very real and something that you can adjust and check again to make sure that your exposure reduces. So for magnetic fields, we use the term flux density. And you will normally see this nomenclature microtesla. And you saw those studies we were looking at with leukemia children was in microtesla. Now, where is it? Okay. I've got a little measuring device here. There it is. So this is a milligaussian device. Milligauss. And you'll see when I put it near these things, it goes crazy. When I put it near my computer, it goes crazy as well. But when I come back, there's a certain point where the signal reduces. So even, gosh, look at this, even when I'm standing here. So you need to be a full arm's length away from your computer. So what is happening when you've got your computer on your lap, the proverbial laptop? You're irradiating your lower body. Okay, so we measure in microtesla. Remember, a microtesla is 10 times less than milligauss. So sorry, I'll just go back one. So you can see, is the cursor working on the screen or not?
No. No.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So there you can see microtesla 0.02 and milligauss is 0.2. So you can see the German building biologists. Have we got any building biologists in the room today? So the building biologists are these amazingly savvy people who can come into your home and do all these tests and say, guys, your home is cool, or there's dangerous stuff going on here, either from a mold point of view, or a chemical point of view, or an electromagnetic point of view. And they say that there's a slight risk between 0.02 to 0.1 microtesla. But once you get over 0.1 microtesla to 0.5, the risk goes up. And above 0.5 is extreme concern. And that can also be measured in milligauss. Okay. Anything over 1 milligauss. And my little recorder here was 10 milligauss. When I'm on top of the screen, 10 milligauss coming down to, right now I'm 7 milligauss, which is extreme concern. Look at that. Okay. Let's move on. Low frequency doesn't only have to be electric fields, it can be magnetic fields, magnetic fields and electric fields can all be low frequency. But when it's electric fields, we measure it in volts per meter. V per M, volts per meter. And you can see no concern is less than 0.3, greater than 1.5 is concern. And you will see on the Wilson's Creek document, most of the houses were above 1.5. And above 10 is extreme concern. For that we use a different meter. This is, with me, turn it on, turn the volume up. So where I'm standing, the microphone, I'm bionic at the moment. Okay. So this is it. Sometimes things are electronic that we don't even know. Like when we're using our cursor without a cord. That's electronic. When you're sitting in front of your television and you're scrolling up and down looking at different programs, that's electronic. So radio frequency is probably the most important measure. And this is in microwatts per meter squared. Be very careful when you're looking at an industry document because it will often be in milliwatts per centimeter squared. So a milliwatt is 1,000 times bigger than a microwatt. And if it's in centimeters, you've also got to times that by 100 to get to microwatts per meter squared. So for example, the power density of radio frequency, this is just to measure radio frequency, normally less than 0.1 is no concern, 10 to 1,000 is severe concern, greater than 1,000 is extreme concern. We are told, according to the standard and according to ICNIP, that we can be exposed to 10 million microwatts per meter squared, and that is of no concern, and we can be exposed to that for unlimited periods of time. This is what we're dealing with. Now, if you look carefully, I'll just try and point the cursor over this, that ICNIP say up to 10 million microwatts per meter squared. The EU Parliament and STOIA, which is one of the departments that looks at this, is 100 microwatts. Bund, the German building organization, less than 10 microwatts. The Bioinitiative group puts it at 3 to 6 microwatts. And the Austrian Medical Association, not the Australian, the Austrian Medical Association puts it at less than 1 microwatt. In nature, they're about 6 decimals less than 1 there. That puts it at about 1/1,000,000th of a microwatt per meter squared. So, I don't know if you can see that. I know the numbers are very small, and they're small for me too. If you look in this column over here, this is where you have the RF, the radio frequency in microwatts per, I think it's milliwatts per centimeter squared. Sorry, I can't make that bigger. But I'll just read from my notes on the side that there's 6,750 microwatts per meter squared for the most exposed houses. These are these houses in the middle here. And remember, 6,000 is 6 times over the highest limit of that 1,000. And safety should be less than 10 microwatts per meter squared. So this is a 600 times increase over the safety level, which has been documented by many organizations.
And is that caused by towers or people's devices?
No, this will be caused by the tower. This is the prospective exposure from the radio frequency. And also the volts per meter in this column over here. If I get the cursor going, the volts per meter for a number of houses are also going to be above that. And you can see it's referenced at the bottom as well. But just the principle, don't worry about the numbers. The principle is the important thing.
And what distance?
The distance can be somewhere between 200 to 400 meters is the highest exposure. And just to show you how ridiculously insane the exposure from 5G is going to be, this was a project that Raymond and I were working on for some people in the Sydney area. A 5G, it's very clever. The 5G base stations are tiny little boxes like this, put up on a street pole. They look really innocuous. But when we looked at the paperwork, which I'm not sure if it came out clearly, but let's get the cursor. The exposure was 207 milliwatts per centimeter squared. That equates to 207,000 microwatts per meter squared. And that is considered safe. And this was going to be projected directly into this house where this little girl and her parents sleep bedroom next to each other, 207,000 microwatts per meter squared. And the volts per meter was also way above what's considered normal. Okay, now because of the craziness with the computers, the Bioinitiative group have done some amazing charts on the exposure effect on human beings and on animals, and all of the things that Victor was speaking about, from ridiculously low levels, from levels way below 1 microwatt per meter squared, way below 1 microwatt per meter squared, and going right up into these sort of dangerous zones within the so-called safety spectrum. And this Bioinitiative report covers this across all domains in medicine. So there's an extraordinarily large amount of data. Are we on the same page here, where the authorities tell us one thing, but we know that animals are being affected, plant life is being affected, trees are being affected. I heard from Steve that trees are dying. Trees are dying, that the trees closest to the tower are dying. But the standard allows us unlimited access. So let's go visit some RF emitting towers and decide if we would live there. So there's this extraordinary study done in Brazil. The study is called Mortality by Neoplasia in Cellular Telephone Base Stations in the Belo Horizonte municipality. They had a large number of deaths. And to cut to the chase, you can see The largest accumulated electric field measured was 12.4 volts per meter. Now you understand, anything over 1.5 is risk, and the smallest was 0.4, and the largest power density was 40.78 microwatts per centimeter squared, but that equates to 4,780 microwatts per meter squared, and that's way above what would be considered healthy. And so, I don't know, in this municipality picture, all the red dots is where these base stations were, and the crosses were unfortunate deaths. And you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, there's an accumulation of deaths around these base stations. And you can see on the extreme left how the death rates decreased as they approximated 1 kilometer, 1,000 meters away from the base station. In Netanya, in Israel, they found that a study was done on how many people was it? About 622 subjects who developed cancer compared to 622 subjects living in an area close to the tower compared to controls, 1,222 controls away from this tower. And they measured them a year before the tower came on and then measured them during exposure. And they found that there was a 4.15-fold increased risk of developing cancer. There's an extraordinary study done in Styria, in the district of Styria in Austria, municipalities of Hausmannstatten and Wasselsberg, where they looked at people in an area of 1,200 meters away from a base station, starting off with a 200-meter inner radius and out to 1,200 meters across 3 exposure times, so what they call the latency period, which is beforehand, and then during and a after period, or an after effect period. And what was found that the people living close to the tower had a much higher risk of cancer. But more than that, it was not only the distance from the tower, but also the power density measured in microwatts per meter squared. And again, they found that those that lived in a density of greater than 1,000, if I can find the cursor, greater than 1,000 microwatts per meter squared, had a 23 times increased risk for breast cancer. You know how they say, but wait, there's more? For brain cancer, there was 121 times increased risk. I don't even know how much percentage. You can't, that's thousands, tens of thousands of percent increased risk. Okay, and here you can see it. The left-hand column, less than 10 microwatts, there's no increased risk across all the measurement areas. So all cancers, breast cancer and brain cancer. But as you move off to the right-hand side, as that power density increases, and especially when it goes above 1,000 microwatts, one's in big trouble. Similarly, there was a study in Germany in the town of Naila in Oberfranken. This is a remote little town with very little industry, very little electronic industry. And they found again that people living close to the tower were at an increased risk. But this risk was 3-fold higher in the 5 to 10 year period. So the longer the exposure, the closer you are, and the stronger the density of the current, the more exposed you are to frequency. So risks of increased cancer under 400 meters from a cell tower. Okay. And again, this just shows the data compared to around the tower compared to, I'll just bring my cursor, that is elsewhere in this little town that was a long way away from the tower. Okay. And so the epidemiological evidence for health risks from a mobile phone base station. This was a study by Professor Vinny, and he found that 8 out of 10 epidemiological studies reported adverse neurobehavioral symptoms or cancer in populations living less than 500 meters. Now, we drove through this beautiful little town of yours, and there's a huge tower just across the way here. I reckon we're not more than 500 meters away from it. So if you have a house right here, you are putting yourself in harm's way.
So that would be the tower. This is school.
I know this is a school, but what I'm saying is if you lived right here, you're putting the kids in harm's way and you're putting yourself. Yeah.
People told the other day, across the road there, so.
Yeah. And this is why we are all so passionate about this, because we want to protect the ones we love. We want to protect our children. We want to protect ourselves. We want to protect our friends, our family, our community. We want to protect the environment. We want to use this stuff, but we want to use it safely. And if we can't use it safely, I for one would go back to dial-up. I would hardwire. I would be prepared to hardwire and drive long distances, because at least we know we're safe. Steve's beautiful place up in the hills, up in the hinterland where we stay, is absolute paradise. If we can evoke that sort of paradise up in the hills in our own lives, knowing that we are drinking beautifully clean water, everything is vibrating with radiance and love and harmony, and we can live like that, then that to me is exceptional living. And I don't think we should settle for anything less than that. So let's see, we know this stuff now. So let's look at some of the symptoms, because this is what I deal with every day, the symptoms. Nausea, headache, dizziness, irritability, discomfort, nervousness, depression, sleep disturbance, memory loss, lowering of libido. Okay, no offense to my colleagues, to GPs, but if you go into a GP with symptoms like this, what do they say to you? You will normally get a prescription or be sent off to the psychiatrist. We need to do the hard yards. We need to upgrade our skills. We need to listen to our patients. We need to deal with their difficulties and not think that these are irrational people with irrational symptoms. These are real people like you and I, who are sensitive, who are passionate, who are vibrant people, and they are in trouble. And we are not listening to them, and that's a travesty of the system, of the political system, of the personal system. We need to up our skills. So let's look at the European Parliament back in 2001 already had recommendations to protect. They realized that there are problems from radiation and changes need to be made following the German Building Biology Institute's recommendations. The safety limit for power density in bedrooms should be below 10 microwatts per meter squared. Okay. A moment ago I spoke to you about 207,000 microwatts per meter squared. And the UK Parliament in 2007, they actually listened to the authors of the Bioinitiative report, the 2007 Bioinitiative report, and they put things in progress so that the UK Council's IPNIRP guidelines of 1999 could be upgraded using the information from the Bioinitiative report. And in 2011, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, this is 47 countries whose goal is to protect the safety and the well-being and the democracy of their people. They put out a document adopting the potential dangers of electromagnetic fields and the effect on the environment. It's great. But it's only the start, because this has to be implemented, and it just appears that it's not being implemented. We're going to change tracks for a moment. We're going to talk now about a fascinating illness called EMF syndrome, also known as electromagnetic hypersensitivity. How many people in this room, if you've got to work on your computer for a few hours, or if you've got to stay on the phone, or people who use a portable phone because it's so handy, isn't it? But it's an absolute disaster, because if you put that portable phone to your ear, you are in big trouble. How many people notice the sensitivity in this room? Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. But some people are exquisitely sensitive to the point that if they know if you have your mobile phone on in your pocket. Okay. I have a lady that Raymond and I have been looking after in southern Tasmania who went to live there because She initially had chronic fatigue syndrome, which some people in this room may well have had, because my experience is that the people who are electromagnetically sensitive and who have multiple chemical sensitivity syndrome, the chaos starts with chronic fatigue syndrome. There's a dysfunction of immunity and dysfunction of the mitochondrial system, which means they haven't got energy to detoxify, they haven't got energy to think. The liver isn't working, the bowels aren't working, the muscles aren't working. Okay. These people, in my experience, are hypersensitive to electromagnetics. And in the Swiss study, they found that a lot of people who answered that they had symptoms, base stations were the biggest culprits, cell phones, obviously cordless phones, and high voltage power lines. And absolutely routers, Wi-Fi routers, yeah. But at the time, Wi-Fi routers weren't out. Okay, but this is a much maligned illness. If you go to Wiki and you read about electromagnetic hypersensitivity, these people are considered to be psychological misfits. Their symptoms are all made up. They've got a somatization syndrome. Basically, it's a polite way of saying, you're off your face. You're not, this is a psychiatric illness. However, the Austrian Medical Association, who I applaud, I think they're the first medical organization who realizes that there is a problem. And the problem is that these people are having genuine symptoms, and as I said, you can see chronic fatigue, multiple chemical sensitivity, fibromyalgia, and there is actually a biological mechanism, and that's what I'm actually going to talk with you today. And the mechanism is what we call, we all know the word oxidation. You know what happens if you leave your car down at the sea? It rusts. And what is rust? It's oxidation, it's damage, it's breakdown, it's destruction. Well, we get destroyed, we get damaged, we get broken down by oxidative and nitrositive stress from the combination of superoxide and nitric oxide, forming this insanely dangerous substance called peroxynitrite. And peroxynitrite is a biological terrorist. It basically blows up and destroys. It leaves a path of destruction. And when this happens in our brain, we have neuroinflammation, neurooxidation, neurodegeneration. How would that make you feel? Do you think people would complain of nausea and dizziness and headache and lack of energy? 100%. And in Sweden, as I said, the EMF syndrome has been recognized, and they now have a special resolution. It's part of the UN Charter. And employers who have got electromagnetic hypersensitivity get special compensation from the Swedish government. I wish our government would see what the Swedish government are doing and look after the thousands of people who have electromagnetic hypersensitivity, because these people are suffering extraordinarily, and they get turned away from GPs, they get turned away from specialists, and they have no one to turn to. If you can't trust your doctor, who can you trust? You don't know where to go. And so the Austrian Medical Association has an algorithm for these patients. And it's the obvious things. You do a thorough history, you examine them, and then you do specialized blood tests. Jeez, my hand is actually burning from this thing. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Okay. They have a protocol for doctors how to assess patients according to their EMF exposure. These people have sleep problems, fatigue, exhaustion, lack of energy, restlessness, heart palpitations. Look, I mean, it's cool. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. Sorry, guys.
Not at all. Not at all.
Okay, so I don't know if you can see this, but there is a wealth of biochemical data. There's a wealth of biochemical data we can get from our patients. Beyond, when you go to your GP, they do the basic. They do full blood counts, they do urea electrolytes, they do liver functions, they do a vitamin D, they do a B12 and a folate. If you're lucky, you'll get a homocysteine. You'll get a TSH, a thyroid stimulating hormone. And if you've had issues with weakness and fatigue, you may get your iron studies done. But that's basically it. And if that comes up clear, you're good to go. irrespective of your symptoms, you're good to go. Now that for me is not good enough. And so I've studied long and hard to research this, and this group, like the Austrian Medical Association, introduces us to all these new tests that are available. We look at, get my cursor over some of these things like intracellular glutathione levels, myeldaldehyde, it's almost unpronounceable, which is a free radical marker. We look at some of the, we look at 8-hydroxydeoxyguanosine. I'll be discussing this in a moment. This is a DNA damage marker. We've actually got a marker that can show the degree of damage to your very DNA, to your very genetic code. Scary stuff. Okay, I'll just try and skip through. And so again, they give the low frequency references, and you can see in the upper left-hand corner, okay, so greater than 400 nanotesla. Remember, nanotesla, which is greater than 0.4 microtesla, they say is very far above normal, and that's in line with those leukemia studies. So when you're looking at magnetic measurements, anything above 0.4 is a problem. Whereas when you're looking at low frequency alternating electric fields in the middle, we're looking at volts per meter. And they say above 10 is very far above the reference range. And again, less than 0.3 would be considered okay. And what we deal with all the time are the high frequency, radio frequency fields. And here, as we're now learning, greater than what amount is dangerous? Greater than? Greater than? Okay. So greater than 1,000 would probably put you in harm's way. But it would be best to have exposures less than 10, and for children, probably even less than 1, down as low as 0.3 microwatts per meter squared. Okay. So, wow. Okay. So what do they suggest? They use the word disconnecting. We're always trying to connect. But for once in our life, we're going to disconnect. So when you go to bed, you disconnect as much as you can. You even go to the power box and turn off the switches in the power box. You turn off circuits. The last person who goes to bed turns off the Wi-Fi if you have Wi-Fi in your house. You never keep your mobile phone on you. You keep it always as far away from you as possible. If you have to have it on you, I've got this extraordinary case. I've got this extraordinary case that completely cuts out any radiation to my body. So I can put my phone in the little side pouch like that, put it in my pocket, and I'm safe touching it. But I can still get a signal through the top. So we've got all these amazing little things that keep us functional, connected to the world, but keep us safe at the same time.
Where do you get that from?
There's a company down in Melbourne that has this. Obviously, I'm not here to spruik any companies or any systems, but it's out there. The technology is out there. And what does Alpanza say on EHS? Well, they say there's no causal connection between the term electromagnetic hypersensitivity. They're happy for people to have the diagnosis of EHS, but they say it's not in any way connected to radio frequency electromagnetic energy. And that these people may be part of a disorder called central sensitization. And by now you know that that's the problem. So they do what they call provocation studies, and the provocation studies are when you expose an electromagnetically sensitive person to an unseen, seemingly unfelt field. Obviously you can't see the field because we can't see radiation, and they want them to say yes or no whether the field is on or off. And they call that, so correctly discriminating is called electromagnetic sensibility, and getting lots of symptoms is electromagnetic hypersensitivity. But fascinatingly, the authors of this particular study said that although electromagnetic sensibility may be a necessary precondition for EHS, it is certainly not sufficient, as there is evidence that healthy individuals can display heightened sensibility without necessarily experiencing symptoms. So you're doomed if you get it right, and you're doomed if you get it wrong. This is how sometimes, dare I say, corrupt research can be. So let's look at the stuff that I'm passionate about, which are the biological markers. Because when you've got a biological marker, you take it out of the realm of psychology, you take it out of the realm of somatization, you put it straight back to the biology of the person, which you can't change. You can't change these numbers. Okay, so what they found, reliable disease biomarkers that came from the Bell-Pohm study, was that histamine levels are increased. What is histamine? Histamine we normally think of as an allergic reaction. Kids who get, all of us, you may be stung by a mozzie, and there are a lot of them up here in summer, or you may get stung by a bee, you get a swelling, a redness and an itchiness. That's the release of histamine, driven by an immunoglobulin called immunoglobulin E. So they find that histamine levels are increased in EHS sufferers. A substance called nitrotyrosine, which is a marker of oxidative stress. It's basically that extraordinary substance, dangerous substance called peroxynitrite, damaging brain proteins and releasing and then this damaged protein is called nitrotyrosine, which you can measure in the blood now. There's a substance called protein S100B, which is in high levels when somebody has what's called blood-brain barrier permeability. The brain is sacrosanct. God, existence, nature made the brain to be safe and protected, not only from outside dangerous influences, but from the body as well. Nothing gets through to the brain unless it's determined to get through. And when blood-brain barrier permeability increases, it means that toxic substances from the body can get into the brain and pollute the brain. And what happens is we now have a marker for that. Blood-brain barrier permeability goes up in people who've got traumatic brain injury or have been exposed to extreme toxic substances. Believe it or not, EHS is a toxic, electromagnetic radio frequency is a toxic substance. Hence the first slide I put on, which is toxic biology. We can be poisoned if the field is too strong, if the closeness to the emitting source is too close, and if we're in it for too long, we can then have these dangerous markers going up in our blood. O-myelin autoantibodies go up. What are autoantibodies? Autoantibodies are substances that the body starts producing to attack itself. The body is attacking itself. Exposure to electromagnetics can cause damage to cells such that when they reproduce, what comes out is not a normal cell anymore. It's what's called a dysfunctional epitope. It's a cell that doesn't perform the functions it's meant to perform. And so these O-myelin autoantibodies. So what's O-myelin? Myelin is the sheath around our nerves. If we've got antibodies to the sheath of our nerves, what do you think that means? It means the conduction through our nerves is affected. The ramifications are enormous. We've probably all heard of the word melatonin. What is melatonin? It's an extraordinary hormone produced by the pineal gland. And melatonin is almost like the master hormone of the gland, of the body, nourishing, supporting, protecting. Not only does it correct our circadian rhythms, but melatonin is a standalone antioxidant, a standalone anti-cancer agent. Most extraordinary substance. Now, what has been found in 100% of the subjects measured in this particular study of 727 people, every single person had reduced levels of melatonin.
Wow.
The authors also did you've all probably heard of or done or had an ultrasound investigation where you can actually do ultrasound of the cerebral artery. The study is called a tomosmigmography. Ridiculous word, but basically measuring the perfusion of blood across the cerebral vessels. And what they found is that there's a difference, that there's hyperperfusion, not enough blood going into the capsulothalamic area of the brain, suggesting an inflammatory process. And so in the new Bell-Pohm paper, just published, if you look at the bottom, like just a few weeks ago, they've also found now that thiobarbituric acid reactive substances are also raised in these patients. We've spoken about MDA, which is also for damages fats or lipids, so we call it's a measure of lipid peroxidation, but also glutathione, which is our body's major defense antioxidant. Levels of what we call reduced glutathione, it's almost like an oxymoron, reduced glutathione, but reduced glutathione is good glutathione, as opposed to oxidized glutathione, which is bad glutathione. So the ratio between reduced glutathione to oxidized glutathione drops, which is not good. That means that all our good stuff is being used up and there's very little left. 30 to 50% of EHS sufferers had raised T-bars, raised MDA, raised oxidized glutathione, and raised nitrotyrosine. And glutathione-associated biomarkers, the good unused glutathione, was reduced. Okay, and additional markers like vitamin D. I think I can put my phone down now. Are you enjoying this stuff?
It's shocking. It's shocking.
So we can also do levels of vitamin D, we can do levels of circulating IgE, we can do what's called high sensitivity C-reactive protein, and 71.8% of EHS sufferers have at least nitrotyrosine or IgE or protein 100B elevations. And so that's why I say this is a biological condition. And remember, these guys are the canaries. They're at the forefront. They're super sensitive and they're being affected now, which means that, God forbid, we're all going to be affected at a later date. So we need to take heed of these people, look after them, protect them, understand what we don't understand yet, and make sure that it doesn't affect us. Let's look at some of I've actually been working with a laboratory down in Melbourne, and we've actually got these tests. They are in Australia, and they are ready to go. And these are obvious. One can get the top ones in any laboratory, like HSCRP, vitamin D, IgE, and histamine. But what you can't get, the nitrotyrosine, the heat shock proteins. I haven't spoken about heat shock proteins. Heat shock proteins are like our biological angels. When something goes wrong, they're out there protecting us. They're preventing our cells from going through what's called apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. They're making sure that we stay on track and we stay on the path. And what happens is the body has this amazing sense of adaptability. So what happens is when we're exposed to oxidizing stress, our heat shock proteins go up. But when you're chronically exposed to oxidizing stress, what do you think will happen? They will drop. And then we get absolutely hammered. So the longer the exposure time to oxidizing stressful influences, the more strain you put on your body, and the body begins to decompensate. Okay, and so also from Belpome's paper and from the European paper, European is the European Academy of Environmental Medicine. There are some damage markers. We can do what's called the cytokine panel at the bottom, which are these immune inflammatory markers, and many of these are often raised. So we basically discussed this already. Neuroinflammation. I've spoken to you about melatonin and how it drops precipitously. That in the new Belpome paper, they discuss EHS and MCS. Remember, MCS is multiple chemical sensitivity, as possibly being what they call a sentinel pathological disorder, meaning that after doing a meta-analysis, which is taking all these multiple studies and looking at the central themes amongst them to see if they have any objective statistical significance, they're looking at 22 studies for prolonged exposures to extremely low frequency electromagnetic fields, that there was a very high association with Alzheimer's disease.
Wow.
Scary stuff. And what they suggest is EHS and MCS need the World Health Organization International Classification of Disease Status, called the ICD, because once they receive the status, then this will be the basis for clinical and pathological description. It becomes a bona fide condition that then goes out through, legislation, and people can be looked after. So this is what happens. I had a lady through Steve who said to me, look, I suffer from EHS and I had this test done. This is what's called a functional MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. There's a different, MRI is like a sophisticated form of a CT scan, but there's a component of it where we can actually look at the moment-to-moment lighting up of the brain in different areas. That's called a functional MRI. And without doubt, 100% of patients who proclaim to have electromagnetic hypersensitivity all had a most unusual pattern in the front of their brain. And so again, this attests to the fact that there is something really happening. We've spoken about the standard. Okay, so the interphone study. So Victor spoke a lot about the interphone study, and I will reiterate what he said. This was a study done across 13 nations. They looked at about 2,500 people with glioma and an almost similar amount of meningioma, 2 different brain tumors. But unfortunately, this was a case-controlled study, but unfortunately it was a retrospective study where they were simply looking at whether people were subscribed to a telecommunications company. But at the same time, they did look at the amount of time they spent on the phone, but as we heard, in this day and age we spend much more time on the phone. They actually cut off, they truncated people who said they spoke for more than 5 hours. They said, well, that's impossible, and they truncated that. So if somebody spoke for 12 hours, they said, you can't speak on a phone for 12 hours, so we'll do a cut-off at 5 hours. And then the extrapolation of the data. So there's, unfortunately, we would hope that a scientific study cannot be sort of changed or altered. But unfortunately, things like this happen. The long and the short of it is, irrespective of how this was truncated and shorted, greater than 10 years and more than 1,640 hours, there was an increase. There was a 33% increase of brain tumors. And that was on a very a small amount of talk time and length of time on the phone and the overall number of calls done. So confounding variables. Okay. Interestingly, the Alpanza epidemiological update, they recognized that there was a small increase in certain kinds of brain cancers, but they say amazingly, they agree, limitations of the methodology, including recall bias of phone use, prevented conclusions of causality. Their recall bias was the patient didn't know which side of the ear they used their phone. So the ipsilateral side being the side where the tumor was caused, and being the same side as where the phone was held, it was thought that there was bias. I mean, how do you not know which side you're using your phone? Okay. So also the acoustic neuroma. Acoustic neuroma is a tumor in the ear area. The data on this was withheld for 7 years after the study was completed. And the data again showed that there was an increased risk of acoustic neuroma. And remember, that's on very limited talk time. So, yeah, for me, you've got to be kidding me. Because only 10% of the subjects had additional telco phone records. Only 10%, not 100%. Only 10%. Believe it or not, the study showed that people using mobile phones, regular users of mobile phones, and a regular user could be somebody who you were classified as a regular user if you used the phone once per week. Once per week?
Yeah.
Once per week. 12 times a year. Or 12 times, will be a bit more than that, about 50 times a year, but once per week. And they were considered regular users. So it must have been once a month. It was once a month, because as little as 12 times per year. Okay. Irrespective, it was ridiculously low, and they're comparing those people to high users and expecting to get a normal result. You're not going to get a normal result. Okay, so let's go through this. There's an extraordinary gentleman called Lloyd Morgan in the US. He's an electronics engineer. He's written a treatise on this interphone study. It's been co-authored by people, and it's been endorsed by world-leading experts, medical experts, professors, even professors in Australia, Vinnie Kurana, Professor Charlie Teo down in Sydney, and another whole page of endorsements. And he did a 15-point concern as to the relationship between cell phones and brain cancer. And I'll just go through them very quickly. Industry knows that phones cause cancer. There's internal scientific data on this. But also industry-funded studies, more often than not, show no relationship between cancer and cell phone use. Let's see what else I'm going to pull out. I'll move through that. Okay, this is fascinating. Independent research shows that it's an increased risk of brain tumors. Professor Hardell in Sweden found that the risk of tumors increases every greater than 10 years, and this we've heard, not only from cell phones, but from cordless phones as well. But for every 100 hours of cell phone use, the risk of brain cancer goes up 5%. And for every year of cell phone use, the risk of brain cancer goes up another 8%. And more than 10 years of use of digital phones, 280% risk of breast cancer. And our children are even more at risk, being 420% increased risk. Okay, and then he goes through systemic protective skewing of the data. Simply said, fudging of the data, dare I say. Okay, and then industry-funded studies we've discussed. Okay. All right, and so on and so forth. I think you get the message. Okay. So let's move past this.
So if you have more than 100% chance of getting brain cancer, that says you will get brain cancer.
Well, you know, we're all very adaptive, amazing people. And we do the most. We eat well. We try to go to sleep early. We try and avoid chemicals and poisons and pollutants. And so we can epigenetically change a risk from a severe risk to a minimal risk. We're not all genetically the same. So some of us have poor antioxidants and some of us have amazing antioxidants. I have a friend with me here. We were in Northern America, and I climbed the beautiful mountain, Mount Rainier. And the leader of the climb smoked 20 cigarettes a day. And I went, my God, are you crazy? And he climbed Mount Everest smoking 20 cigarettes a day. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? Clearly it's a bad thing, but he must have had amazing antioxidants to protect him from the risk of those cigarettes. That doesn't mean to say that any of us should ever smoke, but it means that some of us are well endowed in some areas and we're poorly endowed in other areas, and you've got no idea unless you test yourself out. And we can now do that. We can actually test you from A to Z, and you can find out how good or how potentially at risk you are. Okay, so we're almost there, guys. You've been amazing. Thank you for listening. Okay, so, okay, do you know what, guys in the room? When you've got your mobile phone in your pocket, guess what's happening? Okay, we're poisoning the very organs that we need to, that, you know, if we are still able to have children, the chance of that happening is very much less. When we look at a study performed by Dr. Agarwal, the study looked at sperm quality and sperm amount, and I don't know if it's very clear, but you can see as the time exposure to electromagnetic radiation increased, the amount in the middle here, let me get my cursor over it, the amount in millions of sperm dropped from 85% down to about 50%. The motility dropped, the viability of cells dropped from 77 down to 42, and the morphology of normal cells dropped from 40 down to 18% as it went above 4 hours. Okay. Again, this is an animal study. When they exposed, somebody in the room mentioned about Wi-Fi, when they exposed animals to normal Wi-Fi, you know, at 2.437 gigahertz Wi-Fi, 24 hours a day for 20 weeks. What they found was, remember I mentioned the DNA damage marker called 8-hydroxydeoxyguanosine. They found that marker increased in the blood. They also, when they sacrificed these poor animals, the 8-hydroxyguanosine, which is a tissue measurement of the same substance of damaged DNA, was significantly higher in these poor animals. But also the antioxidant substances, catalase and glutathione peroxidase, were reduced. Okay, so you're going to sleep with your Wi-Fi router on tonight? Okay. So let me talk about these amazing people. These are dedicated specialists who have dedicated passionate and valuable service to protecting fellow human beings. They're part of a group called the Bioinitiative group. They're international academic medical experts, and also some non-medical experts. And it doesn't mean that if you're medical, it's any better than anything else. We're all experts in our area of expertise, and we all contribute. But these are specifically to do with illnesses, and what they found is that they put together thousands and thousands of research studies which show beyond any shadow of a doubt the extremely harmful effect of electromagnetic radiation. And their work has assisted the European Parliament for policy decisions in recognizing the harm of EMF. So the Bioinitiative group are working tirelessly to try and educate and to inform at all levels of society the risks of radio frequency, and also extremely low frequency magnetic and electric fields. And as I said, they put their protective level at 0.3 to 0.6 microwatts per meter squared. Okay, so they've written a letter to the WHO, and interestingly, WHO now has a electromagnetic hypersensitivity core group that does policy decision over electromagnetic hypersensitivity. But interestingly, most of the members are part of IGNOP. So what do you think, what sort of decisions are going to come out of this? Not very good ones. Okay. And these people have a recalcitrant denial of the research. And they have a close association with industry. Now, these are not my words. These are the words of the document. So there's no good, there's just bad, and there's ugly. As far as I'm concerned, when you expose the brain very closely for long periods of time to high power densities of electromagnetic and extremely low frequency electromagnetic radiation. And you can see the word ROS, that's reactive oxygen species. That's like the core thing that goes wrong. These reactive oxygen species just go, this is what I call the biological terrorist of the body. They just go and cause absolute craziness in healthy, biological, organized systems. And some people can end up with EHS in the upper right-hand corner, or they can end up with cancer. And so the experts are trying to alert at both an international and a personal level to reduce your exposure to EMF. Peter Diamandis, who's the chairman and the CEO of the X Prize Foundation, we've been talking about 5G. This guy is saying, and you know, this is more than likely what's going to happen, 5G is going to connect all of us. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, on one level, one might say, well, that's quite a nice thing. But on another level, that opens up Pandora's box of exposure to these electromagnetic fields. He speaks about balloons connecting all of us, all 8 billion of us from space, that they're going to be space-based networks covering all the light spots. What a beautiful description. When we were at Steve's place today, I call them green spots, but light spots, absolutely. So there won't be any light spots left anymore. Okay, so let's finish off, guys. I think we've done this, eh? We've done this. So the science does not go to establish, remember I mentioned this in the Alpanza Standard, where they say the science does not at all establish even indicative parameters on which a precautionary approach may be based. I believe it does. And I think I just stand as one of many practitioners, many researchers, one of many scientists who undoubtedly believe that unregulated exposure puts us in harm's way. And the reference has to be tightened. We have to be protected. We need to wake up. The death of canaries in 19th century coal mines was the first sign that the miners must get out of that mine as fast as possible because of carbon monoxide poisoning? Are our chronic fatiguers, are our electromagnetic hypersensitivity patients, the canaries of the 21st century, suffering and dying while we debate the nocebo effect and whether they got sensitization issues, while this tsunami of electromagnetic promiscuity is engulfing us? We must recognize and rescue those who are injured. We must recognize the research and continue to do research, but it mustn't be overlooked. And we must make the changes regardless of the cost. And using the precautionary principle, if we protect those that are most vulnerable, being our children and those that are very unwell, then we will be protected too. We need to wake up. And thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper. We'll open the floor to questions, and then at 6:30 we'll have a break. One of the key things I've picked up on here is we're at a school. Mullum High is nearby. There's primary schools and kindies nearby. So we have, within a few hundred metres of a tower, over 1,000 children. And I've heard from the good doctor that they're all very much at risk. And it also sounds like we have biological markers that could prove that they're being harmed. And our next speaker, Barrister Raymond Broomahall, after the break, may talk to some of the criminal and other matters and points of law that can be applied if government and industry won't stand up and protect their own children. Over to the floor. Can I ask people with questions to come up, because this microphone is a bit... Please.
I want to thank you incredibly for this talk. It's been amazing to hear the evidence so succinctly presented, so compactly, but deeper than that, there's something happened in me that has never happened before, of suddenly feeling I'm okay for being judged as hypersensitive. You know, I've had 8 cases of fainting, each of which was under electrical radiation, until they just said, oh, it's just in your mind. And then I was unconscious in Singapore airport for 8 hours, and they said, oh, it might be, you know, anaphylactic, or the peanuts, which is actual chemical sensitivities. And then to come home to all my sensitivities started emerging in this time after I lived at a uranium mine as a mediator for an American uranium mining company, Aboriginal community, 300 electors in the South West Police. Since then, allergies, sensitivities, or every symptom you mentioned. Thank you so much.
A very brave woman. Thank you very, very much for that. Thank you. There was something I didn't mention. You know, we all know when we go to naturopaths, or sometimes if you go to an integrative doctor, they may say, hey, you know, let's look at your mouth, let's see if you've still got your amalgams in your mouth. What have you been exposed to? Have you been exposed to lead flashings on our house when we drink our beautiful rainwater? Guess what ends up in our rainwater is lead, cadmium, arsenic. We become polluted, and there's this interface between heavy metals and electromagnetic radiation. And thank you for mentioning that. That's extraordinary. So we need to, and you know, shortness of time and the moment, in the Austrian Medical Association's guidelines, everybody should be tested for heavy metal poisoning. And let me just tell you something about this. The conventional profession hates the word toxic metals. They just don't like it. They will test your blood, and if your blood level is normal, you're considered normal. Do you know that when you're exposed to heavy metals, it's in your blood, and then within a few weeks it's out of your blood, and guess where it goes? It goes to your organs. So it could be in your brain, it can be in your fat, it can be in your liver, but it's not in your blood anymore, unless you're having acute exposure. Living down in Tassie, we got this place used to be called the Zinc Works, which is where they made mercury. And these people would come up to me and say, I've been taken off the mercury cake building place, had my blood tested, and then I'm put back on a week later as my blood level drops. Well, no, the mercury hasn't dropped. Some of it was excreted, yes, but a lot of it has gone into tissues as well. So they still have enormous loads of mercury. So and thank you for this, because just as an acute exposure from like living directly under a tower can cause electromagnetic hypersensitivity, but all these other confounding events that happen in our life, always grossly unfortuitously, but we don't know. We go to the dentist, we have mercury put in our mouth, and we're just like, that's what happened. But we don't know that what was put in was metallic mercury. What finally comes out is methyl mercury, 300 times more dangerous, which can be profoundly neurotoxic, can increase the risk of cancer. It is a non-biological substance. So there's this extraordinary place in the US called Quicksilver, which can measure, especially mercury, probably the world's best laboratory, and they can measure not only mercury, but all these other heavy metals through blood, through urine, and through saliva. And you get a very erudite level. Sorry, Matt.
This question. That's what we asked.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Not so much a question as a commentary, but I take to heart everything that you've said, and like I'm sure everybody in this room, I thank you so much for what you've informed us of. But what I just want to remind people of, there is one study done in Australia on a complex environment, and that was done by my favourite canary, Mark Broomhall. And in there you'll see the accumulated effects on the wildlife. And when I say wildlife, I mean all the way through to the insects, the microorganisms, the birds, the critters, everything you can imagine. So this whole talk has been oriented towards the anthropomorphic effects on us human beings and the children and the old folks we have to save. But this issue is not about getting Wi-Fi out of schools. You have to imagine the backdrop and the biological effect on the whole of living life, and we have to turn it off. It's our only place to start from. We don't know. I wrote myself to the people who supposedly invented this, though we know that's not true, but they did win a $100 million court case over 10 years, and that's our own favourite CSIRO. And I asked them if they could tell me if there was any such thing as a safe limit, and they refused to answer the question. They gave me a 3-page answer that said nothing, but they would not say no. And so, as far as we know, there is absolutely no safe limit.
Thank you so much. Hey, just simple questions. When you're using your mobile phone, if you put headphones into the phone,
Yeah, that's definitely better.
It's better?
Wherever possible, try and have it as far away from your body as possible on speaker. If you can't use speaker for privacy because you're in an open public space, then you can use headphones. And as a last resort, just hold it at the very end point of. It's better to have the person say, or you say, what did you say? I didn't hear you, just say that again. It's better to do that than to bring it closer to your ear.
and then the other thing was, mine are very simple questions. If your mobile phone is off, is it safe? It's not safe.
So if your mobile phone is actually turned off at the power switch, well then it's off. It's not a transmitter anymore. If it's off, it's off. But so if it's turned off, it's off. It's dead. Yeah.
And then the other thing was, I live out in the Maynard village. There's a little small cell, little in size.
Sorry, just hold that thought. The battery of the mobile phone can affect us as well. So even though it's turned off, the battery is still radiating. Well, obviously when it's turned off, it's going to be much less. But so what you do is you buy one of your devices. So just go online and Sorry. Look, again, I'm not stroking this device, but this has been wonderful for me because you get a digital reading of volts per meter and a digital reading of microwatts per meter squared. And then, but this is more for radio frequency, which is the higher bandwidth. For the lower bandwidths, for magnetic or electric fields, you get a milli-Gaussian device. And these are cheap, you can get them for like 20 to 50 bucks. And they're amazing and they're cool. They've got a little sound thing on them, you see? See, and all you need to know, if you're in the orange or red, that's problematic. And then you just need to back away to see how far you've got to go from the device until it stops buzzing. They're not on my website, but I'm welcome to talk to anybody privately afterwards. Yeah.
And then this last question was, I live out in the mainland village. There's a small cell antenna there. I live about 30 meters from the antenna.
20 meters.
Yeah.
Wow.
Now, so what I heard you say was something. Did you say that the highest point of exposure